Professor Weisæth. Lars Weisæth is Professor of Psychiatry of Medical Faculty at the University of Oslo. Professor Weisæth is an opinion leader in the field of traumatic stress. He is recipient of many awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award given by International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. The topic of his lecture is the 22nd July 2011 terror attacks, organizing psychosocial support services. Please, Professor Weisæth, take the floor.
Yeah, honored chair and dear participants in this seminar. It's a heartwarming experience for us to be on the grounds where Leo Eitinger grew up and graduated as a doctor. I think it's a gift from you to Norway. And it's a reminder that refugees may not only be a burden, but a tremendous asset for the receiver. In this case, Norway. Norway was one of the occupied countries that was exposed to the natt og nebel terror, the night and fog terror. And as you have been told, Professor Eitinger was the international researcher who did the main work to clarify the outcome among the survivors of that worst experience that mankind ever has created. I have to say that in the 1950s and 60s and way into the 70s, this kind of scientific knowledge was seen as of historical interest only, because these kind of terrible events were not going to occur again. But then I remember in 1979 when the American Embassy in Tehran was occupied, and you know, they taken hostage for a year. The CIA came to us in Norway. They had discovered his research and found that his wartime research was the most relevant knowledge we have about victims of modern terrorism. So what I will spend my minutes about is to take you back to the 22nd of July 2011 in Norway, when we had this extreme terror attacks in peacetime. Now remember that political violence is aimed at political leadership. It may actually kill or threaten any citizen. But what was particular with this type of terror event was that the victims of violence were more or less identical with the goal group, namely the head of those who executed the governor's policy, those who worked in the governmental quarters in downtown Oslo, and the next generation of Labour Party politicians who were on a summer camp on an island in a lake nearby Oslo. It was really not clear until a few days after how many were killed, because on that island it was believed to be 700 youth. No exact number, and we didn't know how many had drowned. And the water temperature was 14 degrees, and the distance to swim was about half a kilometer, the shortest distance, so it was feared that several had drowned. So the uncertainty about the number and of missing persons, it took a while until it was determined that 69 had been killed on this island by the massacre. That's a mortality rate of 12%. And imagine to be a father and mother waiting during those critical hours about the fate of my next of kin. Now, natt og nebel terror actually had that as one of its components. People disappeared to an unknown fate. They were to perish slowly in the death camps. But the families, of course, didn't know where and when and what and how. Now, in the governmental quarters, the mortality rate was modest, only 2%. But as you see, the number of wounded, particularly on that island, was very high. Now, Oslo, like many other capitals, are very vulnerable when it comes to terror attacks because the resources are often very concentrated. And as you see here, 70% of the people working in government or ministries in Norway were localized within a radius of 300 meters. Now, this means that if Breivik had succeeded, he would have killed about 750, which means that 3 ministries would have been erased. Of course, this is a message to all governments today, that one person with conventional means, explosives, actually may succeed in destroying the central political apparatus. So although the mortality rate was low, half of the offices were destroyed. Now, to judge the severity of an event, whether it's a car accident or a rape or an explosion, you have to find out about the severity by measuring actually these 5 aspects. The physical severity of the injuries, the duration and severity of threat to life. It may surprise you, but actually to be a helpless victim, to be a helpless spectator to a helpless victim may be the worst of these 5 aspects. The 4th is the often impossible choices you have to make. What shall I do to save my life? How much shall I do to help others? And particularly on this island, a number of youth were killed because they did, you may say, too much to try to protect, particularly the young ones. Now we have studied disaster behavior, the ability to react rationally and survive critical events. And the main finding is that this is, if it's not due to pure luck, as in the concentration camps, it has very much to do with competence. How well are you trained in order to cope with the physical dangers? And then, of course, violence is a humiliating event, which is also a threat to your integrity. And the 5th aspect is what kind of losses? Who have you lost? And there was no doubt that both these events fulfilled more or all of these criteria for a number of those who survived. Now, fortunately, the attack on the government was actually not a disaster in its sociological term, because a sociological disaster is a destruction of a large social system. And because the mortality rate was low, this was only a crisis, basically caused by all the material destructions. It was not sociologically a disaster. And of the 565 who actually turned out to have been on that island, 69 were killed, which means that also these this political organization, youth organization, was not depleted by so many losses that you could say it was fragmented. And it's one of our main experiences and the research findings when you have studied disasters, is that if you manage to maintain the communality, the social system, and utilize it, you increase the resistance to stress among people who have been affected. So the fact that 2 populations here, the governmental employees and the members of this youth organization, all belonged, to rather strong social systems, was one of the starting points in our deliberations about how to decide what kind of health services should be provided. Now, this was clearly a disaster medical situation on the island, because when they were shot, there was no help. And an island, is an inescapable shock situation. Now, inescapability increases the severity of the psychological stress. While in the government, when the bomb exploded, you could more or less escape. Few were trapped. Nearly all were trapped on the island. And this terrorist killed systematically, for 1.5 hours. The first he killed was the only policeman on the island, and he was unarmed. So there was no armed resistance possible here. In psychiatry and psychology, a disaster in the old days really was dependent on the somatic definition of a disaster. So if all were killed, there was no need then for somatic help. So it was not a disaster if all were killed, or if there were no physical injuries. So in the 1970s, we decided we needed our own definition of what constitutes a disaster for a psychologist or mental health professionals. And we decided that a massive collective stress exposure should be the decisive criterion. Now, two crucial questions we have learned to ask then if a large-scale destructive event occurs, and that is, where are the families? If this had been a German tourist bus in Norway, the families would have been in Germany. No? And since 1980, we have learned then that we have invited the families to come to the hospital where the injured are, or to the hotel where the survivors may be staying. The second we ask is what I already mentioned. Are the people affected? Are they acquainted to each other? If this had been a bomb at the Oslo railway station, which we had more planned for as a likely terror event in Oslo, people would not have constituted a social system. And then that would have affected our approach. The first thing we do is to diagnose what kind of event this is, and basically we have three types of large-scale destructive events. The first is a community disaster. And I don't have time to elaborate here, but each of these words here for most Norwegians will constitute a sad history. Telavåg, for example, was a community erased by Gestapo. No one should see that there had been a community there. All the men, about 15, were sent to Sachsenhausen, where half of them died within 8 weeks. The children were taken away from their mothers to be adopted by Nazi families, etc., etc. Now, I know you have worst examples of villages here, where all were killed, but we were Aryans, So in a way, we were regarded as more valuable, perhaps, by the Nazis. But we studied the after effects in 1990 of this terror event and found an increased level of anxiety disorders, increased level of post-traumatic stress, and perhaps the most important, too early debut of severe somatic illnesses. Now, basically, this is a rare type of event in Norway. And this 22nd of July was not a community disaster. In Norway, we have 450 municipalities, and none had lost more than a few. In other words, this was not a community disaster. But it was an organization disaster, because for this social democratic youth organization, the event, of course, constituted a disaster. And for the families of the youth on the island, it was a faraway disaster, because the parents and families lived all over Norway. And as I mentioned then, our policy then is to invite the families to come to a site nearby the site of the disaster, where they can live until and meet survivors. They meet the police, the rescue workers, clergy, health personnel, and we call this an information support center. And this has turned out to be a very useful structure. The parents have to be guaranteed that if you are anchored here, you will be the first to know. And then 1,000 people then came to this nearby hotel and stayed there for these terrible hours and first days with this high level of uncertainty and helplessness. The 22nd of July, for the governmental quarter, the 4,000 employees there, it constituted an organizational crisis, and for the youth organization and their families, it was both an organizational disaster and a faraway disaster. And as you see, we have had many more of these than of community disasters. So we had a lot of experience actually with organizing how can the employer and all the resources of a company or an organization be of help for employees if a destructive event like this occurs. So the value of an information support center then is that families with missing or confirmed dead family members or lightly wounded and survivors, so they get first-hand knowledge about what happened. And of course, anyone who knows the fate of my next of kin will be of crucial importance. And it's not easy for a 15-year-old who survived to tell the family of a comrade if he or she had been a witness. So this has in a way to be under some controlled circumstance, you know, with safe surroundings. And, police is responsible for all information provided, and then health personnel, rescue personnel, and royalty leading politicians, and non-governmental organizations like Red Cross and others try to do their best. It may be hard for you to see this, but we have compared natural disasters with events caused by human error and by human negligence and by violence, human malice. And what we have found is that the severity of what it means to your mental health increases with the degree of human involvement and intention. Violence is worse than nature. Nature may be dangerous, but it's not evil. So it's the sense of humiliation that increases, the respect for your human dignity, you know, increases and is worse here. But there is one exception. We know that in war, the cause may be more important than your life, for a soldier, for example, or for a resistance fighter. Now this is not war, this is terror, but it's an attack not only on individuals, but on a nation. And because those who were victims of the violence on the island and in the governmental quarters were well schooled, you could say, it was easier for them to understand that I'm not only a victim here, I'm also a participant and in an important attack on a democracy. Now, Eitinger's generation called the prison camps, do you know what they called them? Prison front. They were not only seen as victims, but also as participants in the war. And to avoid the victim identity, or not only to be a victim, is important for the way you mobilize and find meaning. It's political violence is more meaningful than criminal violence. So to maintain this understanding that even if I am innocent and only 15 years old and happen to be on this island, I'm also a participant in an attack on my country. And the studies we have done on terror since World War II actually indicate that this is, to some extent, a protective factor. But of course it does not take the suffering away. The other main difference here is that the further down here you come, the more angry you have a right to be. And we should have, this is an afterthought, when our leading politicians and also the royalty expressed that Norway's response to the terror should be one of openness and democracy, you know, and not of revenge or armed retaliation. We should have made an exception, because some of the victims here and the bereaved families felt they could not really live up to these standards, these ideal standards, you know. they basically were extremely angry. So to the extent they felt that this was a primitive response, I think we should learn from this and say we cannot expect victims to rise above the injustice that has been done to, for example, in this case, their children. The other main difference is, of course, that you become scared of people here. While when nature is dangerous, you tend only to avoid certain high-risk situations. So this invades your life much more. Yeah. There was a consolidation of the Norwegian population following the event, somewhat like what we have been told occurred during the war, when the NN terror actually not only created fear, but also anger. And fortunately, in our language, we have the same word for the three most important affects. You see, angst, from anxium, you know, in Latin, means tightness in your chest. It's also the same as we find in anger, anger in English. Now, what does anger mean in Norwegian? It means guilt. So it's in the Germanic languages, we have the same word for guilt, anger, and anxiety. And it all derives from this tightness in your chest, the angina, you know. Now, that means that survival guilt among the youngsters, you know, guilt for not having done enough to save my comrades, or guilt for having survived, can be expressed as anxiety or anger, and not only guilt. So you have to be aware of how closely related these are. And Gestapo in Norway didn't understand how easily anxiety is turned into anger. If terror is too violent, instead of becoming afraid, people may become angry. And this, of course, makes you resistant. Anger is a very healthy response. But in this case, they could not act on their anger. They had to try to escape and to hide themselves on this island. But we run then a training seminar for all leaders in the ministries, the 17 ministries. All leaders with personnel responsibility were trained in how to lead employees after a terror event. And the goal was to provide a work environment that supports recovery and maintains health. Now this means that this was a systematic intervention then. In addition, each of those employed in the ministry was called in for a medical examination, the 500 who were present when the bomb exploded, after 1 month. So this was sort of a screening, early screening intervention, and those who needed were then offered treatment. The reason why we could use the company medical service here, which is a part of the organizational model, and not ordinary health personnel, was that the mortality rate was so low. If 100 had been killed, or 750, we would have to use the regular health system. Now the medical doctors and the specialities sort of were really used as a second line of intervention. If all the youngsters had come from the same community, or even the same county, the resources would have been lacking. So that would have created a community disaster situation. You know, a disaster is defined by the discrepancy between the immediate needs and the lack of available resources. So if Breivik had succeeded here, we would have to apply a very different type of model. The youngsters from the island, there was a big debate, and Trond Heier and I, we acted as advisors to the Ministry of Health, Directorate of Health, whether we should mobilize what we call the regular doctor. Each Norwegian has a medical doctor that you appoint yourself, and he is paid a certain amount of money every year just to have you on his list. So he is in a position actually to take care of your health even if you don't do it yourself. He may take a phone and say, I know you have been on that island, so please come and see me. But this was July, and in July, of course, all Norwegians are on vacation. So that was one reason why we chose the crisis team. All municipalities in Norway have a crisis team made up by the community doctor, maybe a psychiatric nurse, a clergy, a teacher, a police officer, but it varies a bit. And the competence and training or experience with traumatic events, of course, differ very much. So the research program now going is trying to establish to what extent has this been a successful type of a follow-up. Of course, the regular doctor was often involved if there was a need to, and many. Now, the prevalence rate of post-traumatic stress among the returning youth is between 70 and 50% after a half year. So there are large-scale and severe consequences of the massacre on the island. In the governmental quarters, we have just Trond Hayes project has. I hope I'm not stealing your power.
Oh,
Are you going to talk about, I hope, a different event? That's at least the plan. I think it was a 7-fold higher prevalence rate among those who were present when the bomb exploded than among those who were not there. So we were relieved that when we say first priority are those who were there when the bomb exploded, and then we forget about the 3,500 who have just had their work situation very much disturbed. Yeah, so the model used for the 4,000 employees then was a combination of the company health services, the work environmental services, and security. Now, what is the what's the advantage of using a company medical service instead of using the regular health services? Well, first of all, they are all familiar to everyone among the employees. They know the organization. It was new to me that each of the 17 ministries had its own culture. It differed very much. And actually, each ministry was its own employer, so this was much more complicated than we had believed. And since it comprises all, from the prime minister down to the clerk, this is not a stigmatizing kind of health service. And as you know, they work mainly preventive, not curatively. But on this occasion, it was decided that if they have capacity, they should also do immediate health services and treatments. What I have found in previous research after large industrial disasters, for example, is that the number of people who become disabled and lose their work capacity is much lower if you use this model than if you use the regular health service. Because if you work within the organization, you can adapt the work situation to the capacity of each employee. For example, in the Ministry of Justice, which here was very severely affected, some of the female employees were so traumatized that the only type of work they could do was knitting. But that was enough. As long as you're able to go to work and be a member of the group, presence is work. Yeah. So, social support, the sense of belonging, shared identity, going back to the routines, even if the archives were destroyed, the data system didn't work, and of course the efficiency of the governmental services had to be reduced for some time. It secures continuity and can initiate a collaboration with these various parts of the organization. Now I'm nearing the end of my talk. I hope I have not exceeded too much. 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry this is in Norwegian, but this is from a similar explosion I studied from 1976 to 1980. We felt we had much more knowledge about the consequences of a bomb explosion than of that massacre on the island, because that is not similar to anything that has happened in the free world in peacetime anywhere. And as you see here, those 66 industrial workers who were in the midst of the explosion, they had anxiety, re-experiences of the event. You know, the brain has super memory of existential threats, so it keeps coming back to you. It's not easily forgotten like everyday events. Sleep disturbances, 83%. Nightmares, 61%. I could mention that Eitinger, how did he view his nightmares? Because he also suffered from a concentration camp syndrome. He had an existential attitude to his nightmares. Because his nightmares, of course, were full of those who died in the camp. And his attitude was, as long as I dream about them, I keep their memory alive. So instead of seeing this as a painful symptom that could disturb your sleep, you know, this was, I would say, an existential attitude. Startle responses, fear of the cycle, the accident, irritability, and this is survival guilt. And now these are all the other who were present when the explosion occurred, but further away. And these are the ones who were not at work. So we had some knowledge about if your workplace is destroyed and your workmates are killed, how about you? Now after 4 years, you see the difference here, that still 1 out of 5 of those who are in the midst of the disaster are suffering from post-traumatic stress, while if you're further away, hardly anyone. So the crucial importance of proximity, of being there when it occurred, was the basis for the way we prioritized in this situation. Now what's extraordinary about this is that hardly anyone here were disabled. They were able to keep on working, often with adaptive type of work, but they were not unemployed. So now the big challenge for us and Trond's group, who's mainly responsible for the follow-up here and the research, is to see whether the government and the ministries are as good as adapting the workplace to the health of the employees as this industrial company was in 1976 to 1980. Yeah, that was it.